Welcome to the German Climate Pavilion at COP28 in Dubai. Ambitious, just together.
Welcome, everyone. My name is Bruno Stagno. I'm the Chief Advocacy Officer at Human Rights Watch. It's my pleasure to be moderating today's panel. For those of you who might want translation, the English is channel 1 and Portuguese is channel 2. We at Human Rights Watch are very privileged in being able to bring this extraordinary panel to this side event here at the German Pavilion. And let me first start out by thanking the German government and the wonderful team here at the German Pavilion for making the... Dois no funciona? Apparently there's an issue with the Portuguese interpretation. Yeah, it's going now? Okay. Tudo bem? Okay, good. Yeah, so we really want to focus today about youth climate activists and the risks that they are facing. We believe that this is an issue that requires much more attention within the UNFCCC process at COP28 and into future COPs. Now, as many of you know, in recent years we have had extraordinary rise in youth activism on climate change and environmental issues. Youth activists and young adults have not only organized school protests, but also organized mass protests. They have challenged political and corporate leaders, and they have also supported their local communities as they basically tackle the risks of the climate crisis. Unfortunately, in embarking in this youth activism, many of them have unfortunately faced tremendous risks. We at Human Rights Watch and others have been documenting not only the fact that they are submitted to harassment and threats, administrative or fines, arrests, detention, imprisonment, and in some cases even killings. This is, of course, extremely unfortunate. At times they're also labeled as terrorists or at times as left-wing extremists. As hard as some of the truths that these youth activists want to share with governments, it is just unacceptable that governments are not living up to their obligations with regards to the rights of freedom of expression, freedom of association, and freedom of assembly. And today in this panel, we have the privilege of hearing from a number of voices. First of all, from youth climate activists about the work that they do and the risks that they are facing. They really are center stage, and I want to commend each and one of you for the very courageous work you undertake. Also, we have the chance of hearing from the State Secretary and from the German government as to the steps that it is taking in order to protect youth activism and environmental defenders. And then we have the privilege of being joined by United Nations experts, and I will be introducing each and every one about the obligations that governments have vis-a-vis the climate challenge and activism. This panel will last 2 hours. The first half will basically be a moderated exchange with each one of the panelists. Then we will open up for questions. So do prepare any in case you have. And then we will close with basically parting thoughts by each one of our distinguished panel members. Without further ado, let me maybe start presenting our distinguished panelists. I'll start out with, from the left to the right, with Luisa Neubauer from Germany, who is with Fridays for Future. Thank you, Luisa, for being with us. Then we have Francisco Campesai, who is the United Nations Special Rapporteur on the Rights of Indigenous People. We have Anna Lohrmann, who is the State Secretary of the Federal Foreign Office of the German government. Thank you for being with us and hosting us. Then we have Tiago Henrique Carai Checupa, who is from Brazil, Guarani. Thank you, muito obrigado, for being here. Then we have Anne Skelton, who is the chair of the United Nations Committee on the Rights of the Child. And last but not least, we have Patience, who is with us from Uganda and from Fridays for Future. And I really look forward to talking about the work you're doing in each one of your respective areas. Let me maybe start out with a subset of the youth activists and the types of risks that these people are facing by basically focusing on indigenous peoples. So, Tiago, if the interpretation to Portuguese is working, I'd like to ask you, could you maybe share some of the challenges that you and your colleagues are facing in your efforts to address, of course, the threats to the Amazon jungle? Is it no funciona? Si funciona?
Boa tarde a todos. Gostaria de agradecer esse espaço. Eu sou o Tiago Henrique Carajecupé, pertenço à nação Guarani. Bom, primeiramente quero lembrar que no último ano a América Latina foi letal para todos os ativistas e defensores humanos. Nós tivemos um ranking liderado pela Colômbia e pelo Brasil de morte a pessoas que estavam lutando por direito. Bom, no começo desse ano, eu também sofri uma tentativa de homicídio em meu território, a terra indígena Jaraguá, que fica na capital de São Paulo. O Pico do Jaraguá é o ponto mais alto da cidade, onde em 1580 foi invadido por um bandeirante chamado Afonso Sardinha, traficante de escravo angolano e matador do meu povo. Meu povo sempre resistiu para permanecer nesse território, pois temos uma memória ancestral, temos o nosso entendimento de mundo além da matéria. E a nossa resistência, ela vem desde sempre. Conquistamos a proteção e a demarcação do nosso território em 2015, mas em 2017 o governo Temer, que tomou o governo da presidente Dilma, iniciando um processo de golpe, criou uma portaria de desdemarcação. Não sei como vai traduzir isso, mas o nosso território foi desdemarcado por uma portaria inconstitucional e que hoje aguarda que o presidente Lula revogue essa portaria para que traga segurança ao meu território. Enquanto isso não acontece, a especulação imobiliária tenta invadir o nosso território para construir prédios, para construir transportadoras. Eles alegam por nós estarmos próximos às rodovias, ferrovias, que o nosso território é propício a virar uma área de logística. E nós mostramos que não, que a terra ela é sagrada para nós. Nós não temos posse sobre a terra. Nós somos a própria terra. Nós somos iguais a todos os seres que ali vivem, os pássaros, as águas, as árvores. Todos os seres devem ter direito à vida, mas nem mesmo a nossa vida, de quem protege aquele lugar, está sendo respeitada e está sendo protegida nesse momento. Eu acredito que a COP deva ser um espaço onde possa nos possibilitar mais escuta, mais diálogo, porque o que eu estou vendo aqui é empresas que ferem o nosso direito, que ferem o nosso território, como a Vale, que matou o Rio Doce, que tirou tantas outras vidas, podendo fazer eventos dentro da COP, se mostrando como uma organização com interesses da proteção ambiental, mas, na verdade, eles colocaram em extinção diversos seres que dependiam daquele rio. E eles estão aqui tendo muito mais visibilidade, muito mais espaço que nós, povos originários que lutamos pelos nossos territórios. Nós somos um povo ancestral de nossas terras. E eles, os invasores, tentam nos negar a nossa identidade e nos tratam como invasores. Mas nós já estávamos no nosso território. Sempre buscamos o diálogo, sempre mostramos que levar ao entendimento que a terra ela é um corpo só, ela é um ser só, ela é um ser vivo que gera todas as outras vidas. E é necessário que nós possamos entender assim. Essa geografia invisível, pensada para manter guerras, precisa acabar. Nós precisamos nos enxergar como iguais. Todos nós temos que ter o direito de viver. Todos nós temos que ter o direito à terra. Todos nós temos que ter o direito à água. Todos nós temos que ter direito ao ar. Todos nós temos que ter o direito de sonhar e viver além de sobreviver, além de viver somente em resistência. Obrigado.
Thank you, Francisco. You've spoken about, of course, Vale and others and their visibility here at COP. COP30 is going to be in Brazil. What are your expectations in terms of concrete actions that the Brazilian government should be adopting as it prepares for COP30 in terms of protection and participation of civil society, but specifically more of climate activists like yourself and others?
A principal ação que o governo precisa ter é de cumprir com a Constituição brasileira e demarcar os nossos territórios. Não é possível que vai fazer um ano de governo Lula e ainda exista uma portaria que fere o nosso direito mantida por esse governo. E eles não contam, eles não falam. Nós temos um Ministério dos Povos Indígenas que não pôde tomar uma ação sobre essa situação que o meu território vive. O Ministério da Justiça se negou ao diálogo com o meu povo. Então, demarcar o nosso território é o começo de uma ação efetiva para a nossa proteção, né? Além da demarcação, é garantir com que as políticas públicas possam chegar em nossos territórios. Se não fosse... enfim, os companheiros que estão aqui, a Inimar, que é do Instituto Casa, terem articulado ação para que eu pudesse sair do território em segurança, talvez hoje eu não estivesse aqui para estar dialogando com vocês. E é muito triste viver essa situação, com medo de morrer na frente do filho, ou até mesmo de ter nossa família machucada. Então, eu acredito que o governo poderia fazer muito, e vocês que têm, né, a oportunidade de dialogar com esse governo também pode cobrar. Também pode dizer que a situação que nós vivemos hoje é inaceitável. E assim como o meu território vive essa situação, vários outros territórios também estão vivendo. O povo Guarani Kaiowá, no Mato Grosso do Sul, no Brasil, está sofrendo um massacre diariamente. Várias outras terras indígenas estão passando por esta mesma situação. E nós ainda estamos tendo que fazer campanha de demarcação. Quando o governo Lula usou como marketing para se eleger, a alegação queria demarcar os nossos territórios. E hoje nós estamos tendo que cobrar a nossa demarcação. E não estamos tendo a nossa demarcação feita por este governo, né? Eu espero que para o próximo ano venha acontecer de fato as demarcações, mas sendo realista e pelo que eu venho vivendo nesses diálogos, não é nem só acompanhando, mas vivendo de fato, eu acredito que vai ser muito difícil o governo realmente cumprir com as promessas quando o próprio governo se posiciona dizendo que vai ser os últimos a abandonar a exploração do petróleo, né? A exploração dos minérios é o que fere a terra, é o que fere nossas vidas. E, bom, se não conseguem cumprir com o que foi, né, prometido durante a campanha, se o meu território continua com uma portaria de desdemarcação, como eu vou acreditar que simplesmente sentado, né, eles vão fazer isso, né? É necessário pedir apoio e é necessário pedir para que outras pessoas possam continuar cobrando. Eu espero que eu continue vivo durante muito tempo para festejar a demarcação e a proteção do meu território.
Nós outros também. Obrigado, Tiago. Francisco, could I turn over to you, since you obviously have a holistic view as the UN Special Rapporteur on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. Tiago has very eloquently spoken about the specific situation in Brazil. But what are you seeing in your role in terms of the threats to young indigenous activists and other indigenous peoples trying to protect the environment?
Well, good afternoon to all of you, and thank you very much, Bruno, and thank you to the German government to host us here today. Just to explain what we just hear this afternoon, I'm going to tell you a personal story. I was about 11, 12, or 13 years old when I started to struggle to defend the forest of my town. I didn't know that I was an environmentalist. Those days we were not talking about environment. We were talking about only to take care the forest, because the forest was part of us. As we hear the young person here explaining to us. And because of that, I always said to be an indigenous person, to be a young indigenous person is very dangerous for many systems in all around the world. Because an indigenous young person is a very dangerous, because it's the future oppositors of what is going to take place. And I remember those days. It was one of the toughest time in Guatemala. And the leader of the community, he called me one day to a side and he told me, Francisco, I am in a very dangerous situation today. There is a list of people who is going to be killed in this town. And the first person that is going to be killed is myself. But for me, it's not I am worried about me. I'm worried about the second person that is in the list. And I asked him, and who is the second person? And he told me, you. And I told him, but he was also Francisco. And I asked him, Don Francisco, why? You are the leader. There are many other elder people who are in this struggle. Why me? And he said, because you are young. That was his answer. And the thing, what is happening today, is that there are many indigenous young persons who are criminalized because it's only because they are young and because they are indigenous. And there is an example of a young person who was, he was not only young, he was a child, 14 years old. He was killed together with his father because they were defending the right of their land, the right of their territory, because they were defending the environment. And the thing is that what we are hearing now and what I am telling you is the reality of all indigenous people around the world. Unfortunately, today, in this moment, I don't know what is happening in Africa. I don't know what is happening in Latin America. I don't know what is happening in Asia. But the thing is, what is happening today is that they are taking away indigenous people on the name of development, on the name of a transitional energy, green energy, to create an alternative to young energy, green energy. So that's why we are talking here as an indigenous person. We are in favor of the transition to green energy. but not on the cost of the indigenous people's right. And that is what we are saying today here. And on the name of development, doesn't have to hurt millions of indigenous peoples. And the thing is that in this COP, last COP, and before last COP, government, state, they have been talking about the importance of indigenous people's knowledge on to be the alternative of the green, to be alternative of the climate change. But what I am seeing today here is that non-indigenous person is taking, is where they are taking decisions. None of them. So they are talking about us. They are talking about our future without our presence. And that is the main problem always. And I'm very happy that here in this pavilion, we are talking about future generations, and it's full. That is I am very happy to be here today. I've been in a pavilions where we are talking about indigenous people's rights, and we were being talking only among us. So that is very sad to see only indigenous people talking among indigenous peoples, no other sectors there. But here I am very happy to see it's a full room. And that make me also, as a young generation are the future, it's a hope that I still have today, seeing you here, hearing us today, talking about what is meant to be a young person, and especially a young indigenous person. So thank you.
Thank you, Francisco. Thank you for sharing that that personal story. I think it just explains just the very many risks that you're facing. You're talking about the next generation. We have two very young leaders here. We've been talking about Brazil and Guatemala to a certain degree. Luisa, maybe I turn to you to talk about Germany, an industrialized economy, large economy, about the risks, the difficulties you might be facing, administrative or otherwise, whenever you and your colleagues want to mobilize for the activism that you do?
Yes, thank you so much. Thank you so much for having me, for coming together here. And just listening to the two of you explaining and talking about the situation, I wondered, so who are the allies right out there? And I come from a country, from Germany, that was a long time seen as a bit of a human rights champion, really being outspoken about many things, and these we need those spaces, to have that integrity, this voice, to defend the defenders when inside a country or a specific space that isn't happening, right? To grant like a moral kind of allyship from the sideline. Yet what we're seeing in Germany, one of those very privileged spaces, is a space, that thinks a lot about it, or like praises its own democracy very highly. We find as a climate movement, even in our space, it's getting increasingly, it's changing. Things are changing, let me say it so much. And to exemplify that, with the climate movement in Germany, I've personally been organizing for 5 years, hundreds of thousands of people, week after week, months after months. We organized, so we could get the first ever climate law in the country. We organized further, the climate law wasn't good enough. We sued the government, we won against the government. We organized for a just and rapid coal exit, as Germany is still one of the countries most responsible for coal emissions worldwide. And throughout these years, we saw something changing. So our climate strikes in Germany, they're quite similar, year after year after year. Yet in the past years, we found that the very same stage that we would always have for climate strikes suddenly got we got complications registering that stage. I found myself suddenly in the morning having to debate with our police head of police of Berlin, where I'm based, negotiating whether we could have a music box or not. We find that suddenly police laws are changing in the country. And when you look closer, you find the restrictions coming along with those police laws are targeting most climate activists. We find that in some states in the country, you have to be over 18 to register a climate strike, which for a youth and child movement is a bit of a complication. So who will register that for us? And we've gotten to a point that now this year we got together with lawyers in the country having to talk about those restrictions instead of having to discuss that day and night. We had raids against climate activists being put into jail before they even did any action. It's called preventive cases and so on. And we saw suddenly our focus shifting away from the climate justice struggle that we're kind of focusing on in the country over to a situation that doesn't sound like a democracy I think would want to sound like, which sets a standard that you shouldn't be setting, which sends a signal to the outside world that you shouldn't be sending. And that is just one pattern that, we see that pattern around the world, and we see it most heavily in the areas that you mentioned. Yet we see it swapping over even to those spaces. And that will cause a backlash, of course, because that will make countries like Germany lose their integrity and their authority to speak about human rights violations, to speak about repressions happening in other places. And then, of course, we see this also in the very way, and I'm so glad you mentioned the just transition, we see this also playing out in the way that a just transition is being kind of advanced worldwide. So a country like Germany being very bold on a green economy and, getting, for instance, into electric cars a lot. Yet when it comes to challenging, so where's the minerals coming from? Under which conditions are those minerals mined? And what kind of violations are we causing in other places for our green transition? I think we must challenge the notion of what is just and what is not. And if a just transition excludes mineral justice, if we are willing to go green to the expense of people's lives and livelihoods, especially in the most affected areas, there's something deeply wrong about that. And I think these are, what we see are patterns from like the same rhythm coming along around the world. And now we see institutions speaking up. So just last week, a new report was released ranking Germany down in terms of human rights from a good state to a critical state, because we see the violations playing out. Finally, this is getting to a point where people talk about it, but it's too late and it's too little, and it shouldn't be necessary at all, because what we're seeing is a backslide that is dangerous, part of a global pattern, but happening everywhere. And and as climate activists, we find we shouldn't have to talk about these things when obviously there's so much burning around the world where we should focus on, where we should speak about, and yet we find ourselves in those situations.
Thank you, Luisa. And thanks for highlighting the strategic use that you make of the courts, strategic litigation, where, of course, that is possible. And for holding democracies to not only a better, but a highest standard. And if I could turn to you, as chair of the Committee on the Rights of the Child, if I'm not mistaken, the Convention on the Rights of the Child is the most universal of the various conventions that states have ratified. So we're talking about obligations that are incumbent, I believe, on pretty much every state around the world, maybe save one. Could you maybe just walk us through what those obligations are?
Yes, Bruno, I will. It's important, actually, that the Convention on the Rights of the Child, which has been ratified by 196 states parties, the only state that hasn't ratified it is the United States of America. And but this is important because it means that already those states have accepted the rights that are in the convention. And the right to organize, the right to freedom of expression, and the right to peaceful assembly are all in the Convention on the Rights of the Child. So it's not just that one can assume them or one can read them, and no, they're actually there. You can pinpoint them. There are Articles 13, 14, and 15 of the Convention on the Rights of the Child. And it's interesting that until recently, we haven't been paying such a lot of attention to them. But in the last 3 or 4 years, we've noticed that many states are starting to violate these rights, and this is deeply concerning. So one of the, I think the first indicators for the Committee on the Rights of the Child that this was an area that we needed to look into more deeply was that in 2016 we held a day of general discussion. So our main task is that we review states' parties' compliance with the convention. They report to us and we ask them, how are you doing? And we give them recommendations. But every now and again, every couple of years, we have a day of general discussion where we go deep into something. In 2016, it was children's rights and the environment with a focus on climate change. Then in 2018, the day of general discussion was on children as human rights defenders. And part of the reason why we chose that theme is because of what we saw in 2016, that children were stepping up to the front of the conversations about climate change, that they were not just looking at defending their own rights, but actually the rights of everyone. In other words, children were becoming activists in human rights, and that's why we called our Day of General Discussion not child rights defenders, but child human rights defenders. And it's really important to recognize that because they are also entitled to all the protections that all human rights defenders are entitled to. And so the committee started to ask states in our state party reviews more and more questions about this. I'll give you an example. In 2019, when climate strikes first started, school strikes and so on, the committee actually issued a statement supporting children's right to do that. And when we reviewed Australia, I don't know if there are any Australians, sorry for picking you out as a not good example, but when Australia came to the committee, the Prime Minister had just been scolding children for being out of school instead of being in school when they were expressing their views on climate change. And we in turn scolded the Australian government for having taken that attitude. Interestingly enough, in the same concluding observations, we also honed in on Aboriginal and Torres Strait Island children. And what we said about that was not just that those children should be allowed to protest and express themselves, but that the government should actively create space for this. So we're not just talking about respecting rights, but actually promoting the rights, creating a space. And we practically suggested that they adopt a toolkit, that they develop a toolkit for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children to be able to be activists. So I think that this tells us that we're not just saying that states should be passive, but that states should be active. An interesting development in this is that UNICEF has recently issued guidance on the policing of protests from a child rights perspective, pointing out that police need to be made aware of the fact that there will be children at protests and that there should be children at protests and that their policing needs to be adjusted. Now, I'm sure we'd all prefer a world in which the words protest and police don't come in the same sentence. But Louise has already put them in the same sentence, and so it's necessary for me to say that this is something that children are having to negotiate. They actually are having to ask for permission to hold their protests, and they, in doing so, are negotiating with police, and therefore the skills that are needed to do that kind of work is the kind of capacity building that is required. So it's an interesting new space. Although I'm an independent expert on the Committee on the Rights of the Child, I'm a South African. And I want to tell you that it's interesting that even in a country with the kind of history of protest that South Africa has, until a few years ago, our law still allowed children to be arrested if they were involved in protests. And it happened, and it resulted in a case in the Constitutional Court called Mlungwana versus the state, which established that children have the right to protest and should not be punished. And the Constitutional Court made an interesting point, and I think this is very significant, that because children do not have the right to vote, they may have an extra right to express their political views through protest. And so, therefore, states need to be particularly respectful of children's right to protest. So this is the space that's beginning to open up, that has opened up in the last few years. The committee is becoming more and more vigilant on states, and we are providing recommendations to states to not only just respect children's right to freedom of expression and freedom of peaceful protest, but also to enlarge and develop that space.
Thanks, Anne. Wonderful. Patience, if we could maybe zero in on one specific project. We've been talking about development. You come from Uganda. The government is building the East Africa crude oil pipeline, arguing that this is essential for the development of Uganda. You have been working assiduously in trying to ensure that that project does not affect local communities. And you have been on the receiving end of the various tools that the Ugandan government deploys with its allies abroad, like Total Energies and others, in order to ensure that that project goes forward, notwithstanding the violation of basic human rights to many of the affected communities. Could you speak about the threats and attacks that you and your colleagues have been facing?
Thank you very much. My name is Patience Nabukalu. I'm a climate activist from Uganda. And for the previous 4 years, we have been campaigning against the East African crude oil pipeline, which is a clear example of a human rights violation project in my country. When we talk about the East African crude oil pipeline, people it's like gold to the global north countries, but it's hell to communities like ours. Coming up against the East African crude oil pipeline has become not a choice, but the only way we can go to fight for our people, to fight for our communities, to fight for those that have been left homeless, those that have been chased out of their lands because of greed for profits, because of greed for money. Uganda is one of the countries that are the front line of the climate crisis, and they're least prepared for these impacts of climate change. Once ECOP is constructed, it's to emit 34 million metric tons of carbon emissions. Even before its construction, it has displaced over 100,000 people from their homes, leaving children without going to school, leaving mothers homeless, leaving parents with no occupations because some depended on Lake Victoria, where they were chased. A third of this pipeline is passing through Lake Victoria Basin, which feeds over 40 million people. To me, the East African crude oil pipeline is a climate bomb in the making, and we should not let it happen. But as we stand up to fight for our lands, for our people, for our future, for our country, activists are being arrested, detained, we are threatened. Even like coming to COP, some of our activists were refused to come to COP at the airport. 7 of them are in prison. Fighting for our rights has become a tug of war between the activists and the governments, because we are taken to be on the opposition. But who can stand to see their families, their siblings die? It's a human rights concern for all of us to stand and fight for these homeless people. Human rights does not only stay in words, but how is it exercised? I feel like when we start to talk about striking, when we start talking about climate activism, us in the global south, I think we don't have that right. And I want to really emphasize this. We don't have a right to express ourselves. These rights have been denied from us. Because when you come, I've gotten a chance to have actions in Europe, actions all around the world. It's possible, but it's the opposite at home. You can't stand to speak what you really want. But what really triggers all these efforts is the fact that even those that can help, actually not help, speak up for such voices, they have not taken this initiative to stand with these vulnerable people. To me, we are vulnerable because we are left helpless. People being chased out of their homes. I don't know how to express this. Where I'm a Christian, so when we talk about like Satan, they said Satan came to grab, to kill, and to destroy. Sometimes I feel like the global north countries have taken this position. They're grabbing our lands. They're stealing everything from us, our cultures, our traditions. They're killing people here and there. This is not just, I'm not like saying this because, or I'm coming from the global south, but I have no choice but to speak myself out. Activism works, but how will it work when our people are being detained, when our people are being arrested, when we don't have a right to stand up and speak, when we don't have a right to say we don't want the East African crude oil pipeline, because it is a threat to our communities, because it is a threat to our biodiversity. The global north leaders should know we also deserve the rights they have. We also need the right to clean food, the right to clean air, the right to fresh waters, the right to breathe, just like how it is here. When we talk about loss and damage, when we talk about fossil fuels, when we talk about everything, it's like we are pleading. We are not. We know what we want. We need a just transition. We need the loss and damage fund because you have to pay it back. You have caused hell on the African continent. When you talk about extraction, gas, oil, coal, it's the African continent. It's the global south. When you talk about wars, when you talk about what, it's carbons at the end of it all. Let's wake up. Let's be the lead to the future we want. And we want it now. Phasing out of fossil fuels should be an urgent action. Loss and damage fund should be not actually pledged, but paid immediately. People are pledging 100 million. People are pledging, imagine someone pledging 17 million. This is an injustice already. This is denying people their rights. I really appreciate this space of expression because there are very many voices out there that do not have this opportunity. And we are their voices. Very many people are oppressed. Very many people are going through a lot. But they can't express themselves because of lack of rights. Lack to rights to education, freedom of speech. Which type of era are we in? What are we really fighting to have? When you talk about free education, it's in the global north. When you talk about good food, it's... How about the global south, where exploitation is the order of the day? We need to stand in solidarity with all people that are fighting every day to survive. Fighting not to see their children, not to see their parents, not to see their houses being dragged down. And this is reality. When you talk about floods, when you talk about droughts, when you talk about landslides, this is an order of a day in our homes.
Thank you, Patience. Thank you. So, thank you for that. Anna, if I may, lots of reference to the global north. You come from a country of the global north. You represent a government of the global north. Can you walk us maybe through some of the actions that your government has taken also to make Louisa's life somewhat easier whenever she wants to protest or somehow express, her differences with regards to whatever the German government has done in the past or in the future?
Yeah, thank you. I mean, I have to say, I'm state minister, I'm representing the German government, but really in my heart, I'm still a youth activist. That's how I started 30 years ago in Germany in a green team, a children's group of Greenpeace, cleaning a creek. A little bit, it reminded me a tiny bit of your story, because we just wanted to get the rubbish out of the creek. And then a year later I found out, oh, that's environmental activism. We did demonstrations against climate change. We did all that. But the difference, of course, to you and to what we heard from you and from from many young people around the world is that in being a youth activist in Germany, yes, some people laughed at me. I didn't have many friends in school, but I was never ever threatened by violence or even threatened for my life, as you've told me, And I know, listening to you now, also listening to many others around the world, what a privilege that is. That I grew up by chance in a country that is a democracy, where we have space to express ourselves, where we have space to protest, where we have space to organize ourselves. And as you pointed out, Luisa, we shouldn't take that space for granted. We see threats against these spaces everywhere, including in Germany, indeed. You described some of the actions that some state police are taking. This is not under the federal government direction. But also, maybe to add to the stories or the problem, we see a lot of threats from non-state actors towards activists, or towards journalists as well. So we see globally a trend that shrinks space, and we really try as a government now to push back against this trend, to support those that want to stand up for human rights, that want to take their legitimate right to express their opinions. And I think in that we have to be allies of human rights defenders worldwide, young ones, older ones. And I think we can do that by, first of all, listening. I think that's the most important thing, to really listen. We do that in spaces like here, but also, for instance, whenever I travel somewhere as a Minister of State, I always meet government, of course, I have to, but I also always meet civil society, opposition. And I know that others, Jennifer Morgan, also Annalena Baerbock, are doing the same. We provide space, like here now in this venue, but also resources. We have invited some also youth activists from the Global South to come here and supported them in that. We have, for the first time ever, we have youth delegates in the German COP delegation. I think you're here, right? I saw you at least, yes, one, yeah. So I think that's a great addition also, and that shows that also continuously we listen to the voices of young people. And then particularly when it comes to these, to also individual cases of human rights violations, of course we also use the tools of diplomacy, either in our high-level conversations or also through our embassies, to raise our concerns about these issues. That sometimes helps, sometimes in a discreet way, sometimes it doesn't, but that doesn't mean that we don't try, at least. And I think that's the very least we can do. And I think also the point is that we need activism, and particularly for climate action, even more than ever before, and we really need loud voices, because time is running up. No, I mean, when I told you about my days as a youth activist, that by now it's sort of, well, more than 20 years ago, and in those days we were still talking about preventing climate change, right? I mean, that was what we tried to achieve. We tried to say, okay, we will keep the temperature levels where they were. We all know that's not possible anymore, so we have to work really, really hard to adopt policies and adopt them faster, to exit from fossil fuels, to build up renewables. And for that, we need really the loud voices of an active civil society. And the more these voices are silenced, these spaces are shrunk, or people give up, the less we will actually have the opportunity to do what we need to do, which is really urgent climate action.
Thank you so much, State Minister. Let's open it up for maybe some questions or comments from the audience. I would just ask that you please be short, yes, and if you could maybe just identify yourself so that we know, and if you would want to address a question to a particular panelist. Yeah, so let's take the lady here.
Is it okay if I hold it? Hi everyone, my name is Tarushi Virasinghe. I'm a UNICEF youth advocate from Sri Lanka. I also work as a journalist there. My question is for patients. So obviously as activists, you often find yourself having to speak on panels and sometimes having to face tokenism, yes? And sometimes you are invited to spaces that are clearly not strong enough to hold your opinions. We saw you being asked to take your keffiyeh off before getting on the panel. So I want to know what your thoughts are on censorship and tokenism in spaces where you are asked to come and speak, and how you feel about that.
Okay. Can we maybe get a couple of questions to just make best use of time?
Thanks a lot for a great panel. My name is Benjamin Schütze. I'm with the Research Institute in Freiburg, Germany. My question is both for Luisa Neubauer and Anna Lührmann. You mentioned Germany's slipping human rights record documented by a recent Civicus monitor. Unfortunately, you, however, only mentioned the repression of climate activists and not the other factor that was mentioned in the report, which is the repression of pro-Palestine mobilization. Now, Fridays for Future International has publicly expressed solidarity with Palestinians. And I would say that showing solidarity with Palestinians is hardly anti-Semitic given what they're facing at the moment. So my question to you is basically, why do you distance yourself from these statements of solidarity, and how can you claim authority to speak about human rights violations if you refuse to show solidarity with Palestinians? And I guess the same question for Anna Lührmann. You emphasized that you want to stand up for human rights, but why is your government then restricting the space for pro-Palestine mobilizations in Germany?
Maybe, okay, let's take another one and then we'll.
Oh, sorry. I'm Katrin Henneberger. I'm a member of the German Parliament, also working in a committee for development cooperation, and also I'm very strongly stand for human aid. And I'm also very strongly for empathy, especially also for showing respect for the living, the lives of Jews and the history in Germany. So I think this is very important to show more empathy for that, and to also to show my empathy for this room. And I'm inviting you also to speak to me later on that term. And I also want to have a question, because of course I'm working in the field of climate finance, and I think that's very important. And I'm also working in the field of how we can create more access, especially for indigenous communities, especially for human rights defenders. So I would love to ask all of you this question.
Thank you. So maybe can we start addressing some of these questions? So who would want to start first? Yeah, sure.
Yeah, thank you, and thank you for asking the questions. We need to indeed have conversations about these issues. Let me, and I think there are many spaces for these conversations. I think it's very important that here at the COP, we focus a lot on the issues of COP, because they are urgent, they are critical, phase out of fossils. But I'm happy, I don't want to evade the question, so I'm happy to address them as well. You know, as a German government, we have taken a very strong position of solidarity with Israel that has been brutally attacked by Hamas, where many women, children have been killed, raped in a very brutal way. We have also expressed our solidarity. Okay, you don't want to have the conversation? Okay, then maybe somebody else wants still to listen to me, but anyway, we have also expressed our solidarity with people suffering in Palestine. We deliver humanitarian aid. We have even increased that a lot recently. Our foreign minister has expressed repeatedly that it's important to respect humanitarian law, also by the Israeli government. So that is our position. And when it comes to demonstrations in Germany, we say that we cannot tolerate expressions that anti-Semitic or racist, also for that matter, that challenge also the existence of Israel, and that is therefore German police and also courts have a very strong, a very thin or very clearly defined line between allowing, of course, protests that express, for instance, solidarity with Palestinians, that also voice some criticism, but there's no tolerance for anti-Semitism and for challenging the right to existence for Israel.
Do you want to speak first?
Não, vou me retirar. Na verdade, eu acredito que a próxima COP precisa realmente dar espaço para a escuta, né? Mas referente a essa questão da Palestina, né? As crianças que estão sendo enjauladas hoje, que está sendo colocada em jaulas, elas não são terroristas. As crianças que foram assassinadas, elas não são terroristas. E não dá para normalizar a violência querendo colocar todo mundo no mesmo patamar. Não dá para vocês colocar todo mundo sobre a mesma situação. Israel invadiu um território, foi se ocupando de um território, foi exterminando famílias, foi fazendo com que pessoas crescessem sem seus pais, sem suas mães, sobre revolta. E isso não vou me aprofundar, mas nada justifica matar crianças, nada justifica colocar crianças em jaulas. O país que se omite a falar a verdade não pode ser considerado defensor de direitos humanos. Nenhum país que se acovarda em reconhecer que a Palestina está sofrendo um genocídio não tem o direito de se manifestar como um país que protege a vida. Isso é um fato. Desculpa.
Anyone else? Lisa, would you like to address?
I would just maybe disagree slightly on, or make one point. I think that has become very present in this space and in this panel as well, right? The world is under tension, and I think we have all become from different perspectives, and it is a challenging time for anyone who stands with human rights, but has to face, I think, very valid criticism from many sides. I think I hear a lot of people in the German context as well, but also beyond that, asking this COP to focus. And I think here we need to be, I think there's a moment to be humble for a moment. It is a very privileged thing to say, to narrow down climate questions on emissions. We've discussed the violations here. We listened to the stories. Being able to say, hey, let's keep climate to emissions, that can only come for a space where you have a right to speak, where you have a right to protest, where you have a right to organize, where you have a right to exist. And besides all of the tensions in the room, I think it's a good COP to challenge our idea of what is climate and what it isn't. I can speak up and fight as a young person, as a woman, on the streets. I can say whatever I want to because others before me have fought for that right in a space like Germany to do so. In other places around the world, those freedoms, patience has pointed out, they don't exist in that way. And before you can say out and mention any form of CO2, you have to go out and defend your right to protest, to exist, to speak, to whatever. So if people come up now, this COP in particular, and bring these things together and connect those dots, connect those fights, I think this is a moment to respect that and to acknowledge that and to very much challenge us as societies, as citizens, as Global North leaders. How honest are we in that? And I'm not saying that easy, and I'm seeing other ambiguities there as well that each of one has to face there. But I think, if anything, that is one very powerful story of this COP, and it's a good moment, I think, to listen. And Katrin mentioned the empathy. I think that is a good moment to challenge our own perspectives on that one and our own privileges.
Good. Anyone wants to refer to financing? I think there was a question about financing. Yeah, Francisco, please.
Well, I think that the first thing that the states has to do is to recognize indigenous peoples. That is the first thing. And I know that the position, some of the European countries, that they support the idea that there is indigenous people and local communities. But local community, what they are local communities? Who are the local communities? I don't know. I can see the local communities as the city of San Francisco. That is a local community. And when they continue to use local communities, they are provoking problems to indigenous peoples. Already, many indigenous people are suffering because local communities. So some states are organizing local communities to confront indigenous peoples, to take over their lands. You want me to give example? I can give you examples. Where? What countries? So, but especially in Africa, they are using local communities. What is the other name? The minorities, marginalized groups, because they don't want to recognize the right of indigenous peoples. And some states are supporting that idea to start to continue not recognizing the right of indigenous peoples. So, and then after that, you have to recognize the right of indigenous people for self-determination. And self-determination means also the right that the indigenous people have to say yes or not to the project that are going to affect their rights. So, and the figures that I'm hearing here in this conference is that the green finance, the money the indigenous people are receiving in this moment is 0.08% of the total amount of money that some countries are giving for green finance. So you can imagine what is that amount? It's nothing. It's 0.08%. So that is what the indigenous people are receiving in this moment. But 80% of the biodiversity is on indigenous people's land and territories. So, and the other thing is that we have to understand that the solution that some states are giving is that what they are trying to say is to create protected areas. And those protected areas, what is that protected areas? Is what is the other way of, as the people are saying, the green colonization. Why? Because they are using the same idea that they have 250 years ago when they created the first protected areas. Protected areas for government means that those areas doesn't have to have any human beings. And who are the human beings who are living in those protected areas? Indigenous peoples. So we have to be very clear that the state has to finance directly to indigenous peoples and to stop using local communities, marginalized groups, minorities, or other kind of qualification to indigenous peoples. And it's not that we don't want to be, we are against the recognition of the right of minorities or local communities. No, that is not the thing. No, if minorities or local minorities already, they have been recognized the rights. But local communities, I don't know who they are, and if they want to be recognized, they have to do their own struggle. But I think that is something that I believe that is taking place in this moment. So it's a very big confusion that is taking place in this moment. So.
Thank you, Francisco. Well, I'm conscious of the time, so could I maybe ask some parting thoughts? Anne, could we maybe start with you? Any final wisdom, maybe some best practices you could point out to, I don't know, in terms of governments responding to their obligations? Or?
Well, I think I already gave some of those examples earlier. Something that struck me that was interesting about what Patience said was that she said, I don't have the right. I don't have the right to protest. I don't have the right to express myself. And I entirely understand why she says that, because when your rights are denied, you feel as though you don't have rights. But I guess what's important to affirm is that you do have rights. It's just that your rights are being violated. And that's what we also have to think about as a human rights community, is what more can we do about accountability so that, you know, having rights actually means something. It feels like you have rights, because at the moment you're expressing it as not having a right. But actually those rights are there. And the question is, how do we make them, you know, how do we make them real? What seems to be the problem with the whole human rights conversation at the moment is that we focus a lot on the written words, on, you know, the conventions, the declarations, and all the, it's a very overproductive system, you could say, in terms of the number of words it generates. But we are at the point where people expressing themselves and finding that they have no space to do that, it's like, if you don't have the space, then you don't have the right. That's really what I think was being said by Patience. And so it's all very well to say you have the right if there's no space to express it.
Thanks, Anne. Patience, would you like to offer any parting thoughts before we shut down and hear from other colleagues?
Well, I don't know what to really like, how to express myself, but when it comes to human rights, this goes back to all like frontline fighters. It's not me alone in the fight. It goes back to everyone fighting in their lands. It goes back to the leaders. It goes back to human rights should be exercised in all areas of life. When you look at, I'll talk about myself because, as we all know, this COP is full of like fossil fuel lobbyists, and when you speak about fossil fuels right now here at COP, I'll be honest, our government already has people here. And they're like, we are preaching wrong information. And they're like, we are not supposed to say, stop ECOP. We are not here to say what people want to hear. We want to speak what we want to see for ourselves and for the next generations. Even if it's not about activism, when it comes to our homes, allow me to talk about Palestine, if it's okay.
Could we?
Because if we talk about Palestine, they also need a right to live. They really do. Activists also, for example, there are activists here from Palestine, and when we talk about threats that activists get, they're already a threat, right? So I want to bring it back to why we are here. The threat, youth climate activism under threat. Some activists are here under threat. They're afraid of speaking up. They're afraid of what is happening next in their homes, right? As we say phasing out of fossil fuels around the world, when it comes, wars are not only in Europe or Palestine or where. You go to Sudan, go to Somalia, everywhere around the world, we are promoting carbons in different ways. People that are fighting at the front line of the climate crisis, down from the roots, from climate education in rural areas, these people are not allowed to do their activism freely. Talk about climate education in schools. We are from countries where climate education is not allowed. And we are here talking about climate justice. So which type of justice are we going to get when even our people are not educated enough? When our people are not aware of the crisis that is really happening today? This means they're being denied the right to a better future. Every time an ECOP demonstration is done in my country, 10, 7, 15 are arrested. And then we come to panels. I think we have to just change the system. This point of sitting on panels discussing everything, can't maybe UN itself put down the protection measures for defenders, for climate activist defenders? This can be done. And also, when it comes to rights, I think the Global South activists deserve the right to speak, to have voices. There are voices to be amplified. They deserve to also sit on decision-making tables. They deserve to be included in all decision-making tables, because the future, they are actually what, when it comes to COP, the decisions being made here at COP, I want to tell you, they only damage the Global South. They only damage the Global South. And at the end of the day, when we want to come here to demand, to pass our targets, to demand our rights, people can't access such spaces because they don't have funding, or even when they're supported, they will be reminded, we supported you, you shouldn't do this, we supported you on this is not okay. If you decide to stand with the Global South people, give back their rights. And when they get their rights, they will not need to come here to demand for this and this. We don't need also that. We just need our rights back and back to us. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Patience. Luisa or Francisco, any final thoughts?
I'm sorry to take the floor again. Just going to read a paragraph.
Sure.
That is something that is almost a paragraph that I use in my communications. Yeah, and he said, "We are concerned on the ongoing forced eviction of indigenous people from their ancestral land, destruction of their houses, private properties, and subsistence crops, extortion and impoundment of their livestock, as well as ongoing excessive use of force, arbitrary arrest, killing, sexual, gender-based violence, death threats, and harassment by agents of the wildlife authorities and soldiers of the defense forces." That is what I'm using almost every day, because it's every day that I am receiving denounces of indigenous people right violations everywhere. So that is the thing, and I just wanted to say also, to be an environmentalist is not coming to the COP. It's not just speaking in international event. To be environmentalist is a way of life. Thank you.
Thank you, Francisco. Luisa?
I think the last remarks that we heard, both from you and from Patience, I think they cover it. And if there's anything in these times, especially after this panel, I think it's a good moment to listen and to let that sink in, and to acknowledge how much there's yet to be done, and how much to recover. And I mean, when we speak of climate justice, I think of this moment that we can look each other into the eyes again, because we're not exploiting each other and we're not betraying each other. And I say this in the full awareness of the criticism out there, especially against my own government in many regards, and in many regions. So I think, if anything, I hope that you mentioned the young people. We young people find a way to navigate through that, even though it's clearly very difficult. And it's a very rocky road, I would say. But I think that's something, it's a moment to let that, to allow this discomfort being present. And I think it's we should feel honored to have someone like Patience coming here and your colleagues causing that discomfort that is obviously very, very much needed. Thank you.
Thank you. Dana?
Yeah. No, thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much, and really thanks. Indeed, it's a moment to listen and to also understand how diverse viewpoints are around the world. In the kind of conversations that I'm often in now that are on government level, I often hear from governments of the Global South, actually, now it's our right to use fossil fuels after you've done it for a long time. And that's also one part of the story. And therefore, I think it's really good to hear your voice here now, speaking very clear against the oil pipeline, to also hear that there are also in the Global South divergent different views. They are the views of those that want to fight to protect the climate. They are the views of others that have a different view for the future of their country. And I think it's evident also from the discussion now that, yes, listening to each other sometimes makes one feel a bit uncomfortable, right? And the discussion we had earlier about sort of what is an appropriate way of having this kind of conversation that respects also each other's feelings, each other's also empathy, as Katrin pointed out. I think that's a space that often needs to be navigated. And I would really also on behalf, since I'm sort of the host here, I guess, also to really thank you for coming, even though I think a lot of us knew in the beginning also that this would bring some of us outside of the comfort zone, for having the conversation, staying also until the end, and thank you for being the co-sponsor here.
Well, thank you, everyone. I really want to thank everyone, for sticking with us. It's, I think, very important that, I think Francisco said it at the beginning, that we talk to each other and not past each other, that we look beyond our usual comfort zones. And I would just ask that you join me in a big round of applause. I think we're honored to have some really powerful young voices with us today. I think they're demonstrating that human rights are indivisible and that they are universal, and that everyone should be claiming them because you do have the rights, as Anne has said. And I want to thank once again Germany for providing us with this space, to having these at times uncomfortable conversations, and for being a partner to Human Rights Watch now for a number of COPs where we can organize these conversations, at times with a host country that is not very inclined for participation of civil society. So thank you for providing this safe space, and thanks everyone for making the time for being with us. Yeah.
Welcome to the German Climate Pavilion at COP28 in Dubai. Ambitious, just together.